This is Mike Tatarski, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City. Amid the sometimes breathless coverage of foreign direct investment in Vietnam, it can be easy to overlook the country's domestic business sector. According to the General Statistics Office, in 2022, there are around 870,000 small and medium enterprises, or SMEs, making up 98% of all businesses in Vietnam. While these companies may not have the name recognition of companies like Samsung or Apple, they're no less impacted by government policies and regulations, especially at the provincial level. This dynamic, however, isn't always given sufficient attention, something I'm certainly guilty of in the newsletter. In that context, it's hard to overstate the value of research initiatives like the Provincial Competitive Index, or PCI, conducted by the Vietnam Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and partners in the private sector. Every year since 2005, it has assessed and ranked the economic governance quality of provincial authorities in creating a favorable business environment for the development of the private sector. This is done by directly surveying Vietnamese businesses. Provinces or cities that performed well tend to, among other issues, have low entry costs for starting a business, easy access to land, minimal and formal charges, meaning bribery, and proactive creative leadership that solves problems for businesses. The 2023 PCI was released last month and, for the second time, included the Provincial Green Index, or PGI, which assesses business views on environmental policies. Quang Ninh Province topped the PCI for the seventh straight year, followed by Long An and Haiphong. It also led the PGI, followed by Da Nang and Dong Nai. Quang Ninh has attracted plenty of FDI in recent years, but it clearly serves domestic businesses well too, at least relative to other locations. Today's guest is Eddie Mileski, a professor of political economy at Duke University and primary author and lead researcher of the PCI. He played an instrumental role in the creation of the PCI and remains heavily involved, offering great insight and nuance on the relationship between subnational government actions and the local business communities. We discussed the concept of fence breaking, the PCI's background, and the desire to create a tool that provincial officials can use to benchmark against other locations and identify best practices, the surprising embrace of the index across provincial governments, how the PCI is compiled, the genesis of the PGI as a tool for provinces to measure compliance with new environmental and energy regulations, how the index's results illustrate Vietnam's economic evolution, and how it reflects the anti-corruption campaign. As always, if you have any comments, feedback, or guest ideas, get in touch at matatarski@gmail.com. Let's get to my conversation with Eddie. Eddie, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here. I've been following your newsletter and your previous podcast, and I really enjoyed them. So I think this is a great opportunity for me. So thanks for thinking of me.
Oh, I appreciate that. I mean, well, you do a lot of fascinating work, so I think it's a kind of a no-brainer, which is what I'd like to get to. So you were recently in Vietnam, I suppose, for the launch of the 2023 Provincial Competitive Index, or PCI. And also attached to that is this Provincial Green Index, or PGI. I was wondering if you could kind of give kind of a top level overview of what those two indexes are and how you came to be involved with them.
Sure. Yeah, I was just in Hanoi. We had our launch in the Hanoi Opera House, which was pretty exciting. I was on the stage where, like 20 years ago, I saw a Hong Yun concert. So,
wow.
I know. I never thought when I was a graduate student watching the concert that I would actually be on that stage someday. It's become, the PCI has become kind of a big thing. There was tons of reporters there, provincial officials from 63 provinces, several ambassadors, and lots of business people. So it was really exciting. So the reason why I'm reflecting on how big it's become and how I quite literally get my 15 minutes of fame every year. My talk is 15 minutes. It started when I was a graduate student, actually. I was in Vietnam working on my PhD dissertation, and I was really interested in a question that was getting asked a lot at the time, which was what was called fence breaking, or provinces. At that time, actually, it's kind of interesting, like linguistically, the term has changed over time. It used to be called fa zao. or like fences like exploding, but now they say seizao, or like fences tearing. But the idea was that provinces were inventing their own economic policies and getting out in front of where the central government wanted them to be. And I was trying to figure out like the extent of fence breaking, how much it was happening, where it was happening. And I personally was, in my dissertation research, was looking for ways to measure the quality of economic governance, especially for the private sector, as a way of sort of gauging what people were calling fence breaking behavior. And there was one of the issues at the time was if you sort of looked at the economic literature on Vietnam, or the practitioner literature that was being produced by economic research think tanks and people in Hanoi, there was sort of a conflation of economic governance with where the Vietnamese private sector was sizable. And this goes back a long time, but if you can remember, in 2000, there was a really important law passed. It was called the Enterprise Law. There's been several iterations of it since, but that was really the first law that sort of engaged the private sector and allowed private sector activity to really start to take place. And the way it did that is it moved from a certification system to a regulatory system. So if you had a good idea, you could just apply for a registration certificate, and if it wasn't one of the restricted licenses, you could enter the market. So there was this huge boom in companies moving out of the informal sector. And so people were really interested in that. And that was accompanied by a whole bunch of other laws, land law, laws on inspections that were all meant to allow this new emerging non-state sector to prosper. At that time, there were, less than 100,000 of these sort of formal non-state firms. And now we're looking at, well over 600,000. If you take some of the data, it could be close to 800,000, depending on whether you're looking at the enterprise census or that you're looking at tax data or registration data. But anyway, the point was, like, lots of people were trying to study it, and they were basically saying, well, the places where we had the most private firms and the most private investment, those must be the places that have the best economic governance. So they were pointing to places like Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City and saying, well, those places have big private sectors, they must be the best. And that just didn't seem right to me. It seemed like there was a problem there, because there's a whole bunch of other reasons why the private sector might go to certain areas or might be successful in certain areas that aren't about governance, right? They might go to places where there's the best human capital, and those places happen to have better universities and a higher concentration of educated populations. They would go to places where infrastructure, and those places had higher quality infrastructure. They would go to places where there were larger markets, right? So Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City and the provinces neighboring them, it's easier for them to be able to sell in those large markets. A province like Ha Tinh, like, no matter how hard it tries, it can't move itself any closer to Ho Chi Minh City. So I was trying to figure out a way where you could separate economic governance from these other sort of structural conditions. So that was what I was interested in. And at that time, there was the Vietnamese Chamber of Commerce, who's become the partner of the PCI, had also started to look into these questions. The Asia Foundation, which was an American international NGO that happened to be operating, was interested in these questions. And it started with what was a public-private sector forum in Hanoi. And I was just a graduate student, and the Asia Foundation asked me if I would go and be a rapporteur at that public-private sector forum. And I sort of sat in the back of the room with a guy named Doan Tuan, who's gone on to be the head of the legal department at VCCI now. And we're in the back of the room. Yeah, you've probably seen him on TV and like been a partner and a good friend of mine. And at that conference, what kept on happening is they were going law by law by law. So they were looking at registration and then looking at land issues and inspections issues. And the common thread in the conversation again and again and again was that there were relatively good laws on the books, but that provincial officials didn't understand those laws well. And we're not implementing them successfully, right? And so there was a lot of debate about, well, how do you best figure out how to communicate and incentivize provincial officials to follow the central laws that were in place to promote private sector activity. And so Tuan and I came out of that conference, and at that time I had been trying to think about, well, what's the best way to measure economic governance separately from these other factors? And so this opportunity arose with USAID had this call for proposals for what was called the Vietnam Competitiveness Initiative. And the Asia Foundation was competing with another organization, U.S. organization called Development Alternatives Incorporated. And the Asia Foundation asked me if I would propose something for this competitiveness innovation. And I, talking with VCCI and talking with the Asia Foundation, we put together a proposal to create this Provincial Competitiveness Index that would try to measure economic governance separately from other factors and then see whether economic governance itself was correlated with growth in private sector activity. And the main goal here was to say, hey, you don't have to be Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City. You don't have to be close to big markets. There's ways to grow your private sector, even if you're far away, and trying to, and sort of the idea at the time was to create a tool that provincial officials could use. Like the main goal was never the index. And it's interesting, the index has become so exciting. The main goal was, here's a benchmark. You can compare yourself to other locations and then use those other locations to identify best practices. So what are some provinces doing? And in that time, there were provinces that were famously succeeding, like Binh Duong and Da Nang, that were just doing things differently. What are those provinces doing that you can use to improve? And here's a set of indicators that you can use to then track your success over time. So yeah, and we did it. And actually the first year we were worried about political sensitivities. And so we stayed out of some Central Highlands areas and stayed out of some northern provinces that we thought at that time there were some, issues about ethnic politics going on. I did 46 provinces the first year, and we launched it in 2005. And that was super interesting because in 2005, all of the provinces were having their elections, their own party elections for the Central Party Congress, which would take place in 2006. And so all of a sudden out came this index that was kind of like a report card on as these provincial leaders were making their claims about what they had done and why they should be elected to the party Congress, why they should be promoted, came this thing that was saying, hey, you're not doing very well like in this area. And so that was interesting because it actually created some debate. So the party secretary of Hatay province, which, Hatay province has now been merged into Hanoi, but at the time was a separate province, disagreed. They had a low ranking and kind of got us into a debate that took place in the newspapers and to some extent on television at the time, where we were forced to explain our methodology. How are we collecting data? And so it just sort of put it out there and got people really excited about what was going on and the potential that this thing had. And so and the advice that we got back was, why did you only do 46? Why didn't you do all 6? So it was not, don't worry about the political sensitivity, get out there, this is really useful. And so then, so we went back out and did it again in 2006, and we've done it annually ever since.
Okay. Yeah. That's fascinating how, eager they were to get all the provinces and cities covered. So I had the methodology question listed a little later, but since you just mentioned it, I mean, your next year will be 20 years of doing this. I'm assuming the way you conduct the research has changed a lot given the advent of smartphones and technology and all of that stuff. Yeah, I guess how has it evolved over time, and what are the main sort of points of methodology?
Oh, okay. So let me explain the general methodology, and then I'll sort of explain how things have evolved. So the general methodology is it's a self-administered survey, and that is delivered directly to the businesses. So it's not coming through provincial leaders. We're not sending teams out into the field. That methodology was originally chosen because we were worried about interference. and not even at that time, we weren't worried about like people trying to manipulate the index. We were just worried about curious local officials coming by, but to some extent making businesses feel nervous. So we used the survey to collect data on firm perceptions and experiences with governance. We also combine that survey data with administrative data. So we get data from the tax authority, from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment about land. And so we correct for perception bias in the survey using that administrative data. So there's 10 sub-indices. I won't go into each one, but each one covers a different aspect of governance. So like entry costs, how long it takes to start your business, the sort of regulatory procedures you need to go through and how costly it is. We have one on access to land and security of the tenure of that land. We have indices about transparency of information. We also have ones about informal charges, which is super interesting given the current anti-corruption campaign. Yeah, and each of those is made up of soft and hard indicators. So soft indicators coming from the survey and hard indicators coming from administrative data. And the survey itself is a random sample of businesses. So we get data on businesses that are actually operating and paying taxes. So not businesses that are registered and may have gone out, but actually operating businesses. And then we stratify that sample based on the type of firm they are, limited liability company, joint stock company, private partnership, the sector and that they're in, and then the age of the business. So we stratify and then randomly sample within those baskets. So the idea is to get a population of businesses that mirrors provincial population. And then we were worried about response rates. Response rates on self-administered surveys are always lower than response rates on surveys where you send people out into the field. But we had to make this trade-off. As I said, we were worried about interference. And so we were worried about, if you can imagine, two types of biases. A bias that's constant across all the provinces, which is just non-response bias because it's a self-administered survey, versus a bias that tips the scale in favor of one or another because of isolated interference, if that makes sense. And we were trying to create a ranking. We were worried that that sort of isolated bias was more dangerous. But to improve the response rates, we created what we call a situation room, which is a bunch of college students that come in and call the businesses on the phone and help them out, because some of the questions we're asking are somewhat technical, that some small businesses might fully understand, like the differences between assets and equity, because we're trying to measure performance. Yeah. So, and even just concepts, like a concept of transparency, we're trying to measure it very clearly in terms of, what documentation is available, but some of those concepts can be tricky. So anyway, so we have these, so that was the original methodology was a mail out survey that went through the Vietnam Post and then arrived, and the businesses responded and mailed it back to us. So that was what we were doing. So the first methodological change we had to make was, we were originally just in Hanoi, and we hired any college student we could find that was sort of interested in it. It's, by the way, it's kind of interesting, like that group of original college students, they have like their own little club and they still meet together. Now they're all like, some of them successful business people or government officials in their own right. But they all, at that time, most of them had northern Hanoi accents. And so when they would call businesses, say in the Mekong Delta, who were not used to hearing that accent, it actually was creating a little bit of a problem. And some of those businesses got a little nervous because they weren't sure why they were being called by a Hanoi accent, which they associated with government officials, right? So yeah, so the first change we had to make was just to make sure all of the teams had regional representation in accents. Mm-hmm. And we systematized the teams a little bit better, so they compete actually. So after the mail out goes out, like they are rewarded for each of the responses that comes back in. So that's why our response rate in the early years was really high. Like for a business survey to have response rates that were corrected response rates, like getting rid of bad addresses and stuff that were close to 50%. That's way harder to achieve now, by the way. It's so much harder to get higher response. So that was the first change we made. The second, then we've now moved to a completely digital platform. So we use Qualtrics survey platform. It's really nice. It's actually saved us a lot of time and money on data cleaning and data entry because we can program data checks into it. But I actually think the biggest changes that we've made methodologically is that Vietnam is a really dynamic country. Things are changing all the time. Issues in the business environment that were there 20 years ago are no longer big issues today, or new issues emerge and we have to like change the index to keep a pace with the Vietnamese reform effort. For research wise, that's challenging because on one hand, you want a consistent index that uses the same indicators and the same methodology over time so that you can attribute changes in the index to actual changes in improved governance. But then if you do that, you can't keep track of actual changes in the provincial performance over time. So what we've done is we decided, okay, here are 36 indicators that we'll use to track over time that will never change. And we call that our core index. And that's always the same every year, same weight, same everything. But then every 4 years, we actually recalibrate the index. And so we drop indicators, we switch sub-indices, we move things around to keep track of the business environment. So like to give you just two sort of concrete examples of that, in the early days, a big problem for a lot of private companies was bias towards local state-owned enterprises. So these were enterprises that were managed at the provincial level, and had revenue allocation at the provincial level and were appointed by provincial leaders. And they were all over the country at that time. And provincial officials would make choices about contracting, about access to land, access to capital for those businesses. And in many cases, those businesses were crowding out private sector activity. So you would have a business that, say, was in mining, but that started a supermarket that was now competing directly against a private supermarket company, or started a restaurant or a hotel. So they were just sort of cross-subsidizing out of their protected state activity. But that hardly exists anymore. There's been effort to reform and centralize the state-owned enterprises. And so you now have a large number of central state-owned enterprises, some competing at the provincial level, but there's very, very few local state-owned enterprises now. And especially in the ones that there are mostly like in utilities. And so provincial officials started to tell us, hey, this is not fair. Like we have like hardly any of these, and we've scored low in this index. And so eventually we decided to change that index away from bias towards local state-owned enterprises to bias more generally to connected firms, to central state-owned enterprises, even bias towards foreign firms. So that was the change. Another thing that's popped up is that while formal registration procedures have become really streamlined, like it's even possible for some businesses in some locations to register their business online within a single day, in a lot of provinces have popped up a new problem, which is called conditional business sublicenses. And that, for particular industries or particular activities, and some of those sublicenses have become quite complex. And so we had to add a set of measures to capture those conditional licenses, because before we had just focused on the more straightforward registration procedures that were in the enterprise law. So anyway, just to that's just sort of giving you an example of how things have changed and we've had to keep track of them. And I think the PGI is kind of the biggest example of us trying to keep pace with what's going on in Vietnam.
Yeah, which, I mentioned the PGI, excuse me, in the introduction or at the start, which is the Green Index, which, as you said, kind of reflects, the growing importance of recognition of green, for lack of a better word, growth, sustainability, all of that. So what does the PGI sort of add to this?
One thing that's kind of cool about the PCI, and my favorite part about being involved in the PCI, is that usually after the launch, the various provinces will invite the PCI research team down to do diagnostics of the province and to present the tailored data from the PCI index to the province, and then connect their performance to potential policies or best practices that would be helpful for them. And one thing that kept on coming up again and again in the diagnostics was some tension between, and very recently, tension between the PCI and what provinces were trying to do in terms of environmental protections. So the PCI generally favors or promotes less intrusive regulation. So there's an index in the PCI that measures like the burden that firms face in regards to inspections, how long those inspections take, how costly those inspections are, but of course, environmental protection requires more stringent regulations. Actually, getting out there and seeing what businesses are doing, and I think the Formosa spill incident is like a perfect example of an issue like this, right? That probably could have been caught by regulators, right? So they were saying that, like, how do you balance these types of protections that need to be made against this effort to reduce the burden of regulations on private firms? So that was coming from provincial officials themselves, and they were particularly coming from provinces that had large ecotourism sectors. So think like Da Nang or Nha Trang, where protection of the environment, like Quang province with Nha Trang, where protection of the environment is really critical to that industry. But at the same time, they felt like they were being incentivized to attract dirty industries and reduce regulation on those dirty, and which was threatening that. Or think like provinces in the Mekong Delta that do really well on food processing, that were worried about the quality of the raw materials for their food processing. So you could see that there was some tension here between the industrial sectors and where the provinces got their revenue growth. The second big thing was that, Vietnam is, I think, and you've pointed this out a couple of times in your newsletter and podcast, is that this is a country that may be one of the most exposed countries in the world to climate change. It has a large sea coast. Most of the country is below sea level. We've already experienced issues with changes in climatic conditions, increases in flooding, increases in typhoon damage. There's issues with salination in the Mekong Delta, which has a climatic connection. It may not all be caused by it, but it has a climatic connection. But at the same time, so it ranks really highly in exposure to problems of climate change, but at the same time ranks really low in terms of actual steps to mitigate climate change. So that you see that in international indices all the time. Sort of a third issue here, and something that is coming up, is like Vietnam is growing so fast. It has these massive energy needs, but to be able to fulfill those massive energy needs, it has to make choices about how to generate that new energy. And there is a tension here between moving towards coal-powered fire plants, which allow them to be able to reach it quickly, versus more renewable types of energy and how fast that can come online. They have this energy plan, the PDP plan, to be able to do it. So that is coming up. And then finally, just like with the PCI in the early 2000s, you have all of these laws and master plans coming out about the new law on environmental protection, the new master plan on green growth, the new master plan on things. So you see all of these laws coming out. And so the PGI was basically to say, like, okay, how do we once again provide a tool that provinces can have to measure what they're doing in terms of compliance with these new laws, in terms of managing managing growth under these new and changing important conditions that they can balance against the PCI. And so we focused on sort of four areas that the laws kind of concentrate on to create indicators. So we looked at first sort of resilience and preparation for natural climate disasters. So what were provinces doing about preparing infrastructure, preparing resources and services, and how quickly were they responding to these climate-based disasters when they happened? The second one is actually, I think, the most interesting, which is about regulation, and the sets of indicators are looking at first the fairness of the regulation, right? So like, are they getting, like, there's so many different types of environmental inspectors. So, right, like there's just all of these agencies that are doing environmental inspections right now at the national and local level. So are those inspections being coordinated so they're reducing the burdens on firms? How long are these inspections taking? Are these inspections generating informal charges? Do businesses believe that the fines they pay are fair? But at the same time, we're also looking at stringency, right? Do they believe that these inspections are businesses that pollute being held accountable? Are businesses that violate laws being held accountable? So we're sort of trying to combine fairness and stringency in that second index. The third and fourth sub-indices are sort of more forward-looking. So the third one is looking at what provinces are doing to help existing businesses make changes to their operations to become greener. So, and there we're looking mostly at guidance and training, and to some extent regulations that are encouraging provinces to, say, move from paperwork to digital paperwork, or install air and water monitors, or train managers and labor on conservation. So we're looking for those operations of existing businesses and how well those are working. And then the fourth one is what they're doing to attract and grow what we call green businesses, right? Businesses that are either operating in a green space, so clean energy businesses or green production, or businesses that just have a low environmental footprint. So those are the four sub-indices that we decided to measure to give provinces benchmarks there.
What are some of the main ways you've kind of seen the index over the past 20 years kind of reflect Vietnam's growth and development over that time? I mean, I know that's kind of a big question, but I find it interesting. You mentioned when it started that Bình Nhưỡng and Da Nang were kind of near the top, and now, I mean, Bình Nhưỡng, of course, is still very important, but as an investment destination, but is kind of reliant on older forms of manufacturing, furniture, apparel, textiles. Da Nang, I don't think it's quite lived up to its potential. I mean, it's a nice place, but has some issues. And then I think Quang Ninh, correct me if I'm wrong, but has topped the index for the last 6 years.
Yeah,
Which is, of course, kind of this growing hub of high tech investment. VinFast is there with their issues, but their factory's there.
yeah.
So how have you seen that sort of development of Vietnam over time reflected in the index?
No, I think that you're pointing some really interesting. So at the early on in the index, Binh Duong and Da Nang were remarkable. Like, they were the first provinces that put all of the business regulatory procedures in the same building, right? You can still go and visit them, right? Like that you could, and like you walk in those buildings, it's incredible. Like, you could register your business, get a land certificate, get a marriage license. They were all there, right, in the same activity. They were the ones that were first experimenting with one-stop shops. They were the ones that were first experimenting with harmonizing regulation. Da Nang was way out front in terms of trying to make progress on land access and security of property rights. So, they were really setting the benchmark for the types of interesting policies. And then there were other provinces that were popping up. Like, I still remember some Mekong Delta provinces that had really innovative policies about dealing with informal charges, like Dom Thap and Ben Che, including in Ben Che, one of the provincial leaders pretending to be a business so that he could, and try and register a business to see how he himself was treated, which I thought was, Quang Ninh has adopted a lot of those policies and made a real effort to improve the experience for private businesses there. They have they also have a one-stop shop. They did two things that were kind of innovative that pushed them to the top really quickly. One was they started this thing called their own district and department competitiveness index, where they used the PCI methodology to measure the subordinate central departments and districts, and then held them accountable as a way of, that was really cool. They also started to do this thing that's now become really popular all over the place called Coffee with Businesses, where so monthly, like a provincial leader usually the People's Committee chairman will sit down with businesses about a particular issue. Like, so they'll talk about land issues and businesses will talk about the problem that they're facing. And then they will agree on what needs to be solved. And they'll set up benchmarks for measuring those improvements. So Kwangming was way out in front in this coffee with businesses. So they were sort of put in place this very adaptive policy. So I do want to be careful about one thing. Like, the PCI is only measuring the private sector. It like explicitly left out foreign investment, though we do have a separate survey that's of foreign investment. And the reason was at the time, and it's still true today, there's a very small set of provinces that actually attract foreign investment. Mm-hmm. So, and that has a lot to do with what we were talking about, infrastructure and human capital. And so we were trying to say at the time that we started the PCI, don't focus on trying to get that big foreign firm. You have a lot of entrepreneurial activity that you can grow yourself. And this idea that all of a sudden, like, Samsung is going to come down from the sky and create jobs for everybody in Sun La province is a pipe dream. So focus on the private sector. But the foreign community definitely wanted the foreign survey. And so now chapter 3 of the PCI report is always about the foreign sector. So that's kind of the movement of the provinces. I'll just say a couple of things that I think are really cool as sort of like a geeky academic researcher. I often see clusters of provinces that move up together. So like in the Mekong Delta and now actually in the Red River Delta, of provinces that are clearly sharing ideas through businesses associations and working together. And I've seen like these sort of clusters of improvement as groups of provinces work together. I find that really fascinating. In terms of actual trends, so I think there's some really neat ones. In terms of entry costs, it is incredible, like how fast. It used to be months from the time that you had an idea to you were able to actually start operations on your business. And now we're measuring that in days, if not hours, in some locations. I think that is really cool. A lot of provinces have, as I said, moved these procedures online, and so have really taken out the problems of discretion and the problems of going to multiple windows to get your business started, because you can do these activities online now. So that's really neat. Informal charges is the one where we've seen the most dramatic improvements. And like, this is one, there is all this back and forth about the Blazing Furnace campaign. And I think the numbers that we're talking about with some of these cases are like eye-watering, right? Like, yeah. And the fact that it's affected so many leaders is also striking. But what we see is like, so in 2016, 64% of businesses were saying that paying informal charges was a normal part of their business. And that number is now 33% today. And in 2016, it was businesses paid over 8% of their revenue in bribes. Like, so as a share of, wow. Okay. which is almost prohibitive for a lot of businesses. And that number is close to 2% today, which is still, both of those numbers are still problematic, but it just gives you a sense of like, it's pretty impressive. The other one that has seen some interesting movement is labor quality and matches to businesses. There's been a big effort to improve vocational training in a lot of provinces, expanses of regional universities. And so businesses are much more satisfied with the quality of the labor that they're able to attract. Now, there's still, and now with various, like, the surge of investment in the post-2018 after the Trump tariffs, there have been a lot of pressure in certain sectors, like high-tech sectors, especially for managers. And so there it's more difficult now because there's so much competition for that small share of very high qualified people. But for other people down the line, the business training has really, really improved. So those are the trends. There's places where we don't see a lot of improvement, and I think that's interesting. So, as I said, we track transparency of budgets, transparency of land maps. That has improved somewhat, but not as much. And there's actually a really super interesting disconnect, which is that a lot of provinces are putting these documents on their websites, but businesses still don't know them. And so, or know that they're available. So and why that is, I'm not sure what's going on there. And then I think consistent with some other things that you're hearing, we have a measure of proactivity. So as I told you, like when I was originally interested in this, I was interested in fence breaking. So of course I made a sub-index that was about dynamism and the ability of provincial leaders to solve problems for businesses when central law was unclear. And there was a time when that index was one of the most important sub-indices in the PCI, and there had been a lot of growth there. But over the past 5 years, we've seen real declines in that index.
Yeah, I noticed that was one of the kind of the things you pointed out about, proactivity of provincial government officials needs to be revitalized, which is kind of interesting. I mean, it's fascinating. You mentioned the, informal charges are dropping. And I think it's, really important you have this distinction that this is, Vietnamese businesses, because I know I'm guilty of this, of kind of, it's easy to focus on the big shiny objects of Samsung or Apple. I mean, even domestic media, I think, kind of puts a lot of attention on the FDI community, which is of course important, but sometimes I worry it's almost like too weighted in that direction, economically even. But yeah, I mean, so I guess you've seen, because I know a big point of complaint kind of in the foreign business community right now is, things aren't getting approved. It's taking forever to process.
Yeah.
Paperwork X, take your pick. So I guess you're seeing that filter through a little bit, the local community as well, business community.
Yeah, I think So I agree with you. Global integration and foreign investment have been extremely good for, in terms of their impact on Vietnamese growth and the prosperity of Vietnamese citizens. But is still a small sliver of the labor force, and a small sliver of where the growing Vietnamese labor force will eventually go. And then second, there are some structural issues in the Vietnamese economy. Like 60% of manufacturing exports are still produced by foreign firms. Like eventually Vietnam needs to develop Vietnamese companies that can compete on international markets. And so I think it is really important to focus on this domestic private sector, both for the role that it can play right now in terms of providing a source of dynamism and growth and higher and employment, but also down the road in terms of, and I think one of the things in terms of leading Vietnam on the international stage, and one of the things we focused a lot on in the report is the connection between the private sector and foreign supply chains and how to improve that. I mean, that has improved a lot over time, but there's still more work there. Yeah, I mean, it's true. You always, when you've been in Vietnam, when I've been working in Vietnam since '97, like I have, I with my gray hair, so sometimes stories pop up in the Vietnamese press and become an analyst focus on, and sometimes there's stories I've seen before, right? Like so one thing is, like, it's always true that as you head into a party Congress year, that things slow down. But it's just one of these things that always happens as people are jockeying for positions and people are afraid to make mistakes. I think one of the things that the anti-corruption campaign has done, I think a lot of what is happening right now is a lot of officials and businesses are unclear on what the rules are. They're now learning that they could be punished for something that happens 14 years from now, right? And so, like, mistakes, things that seem reasonable today, choices that you could make that seem reasonable today might look very different in a different light. And so I do think it's caused a lot of caution, which is what's leading, I think, to these holdups. And so the way I've explained it before is, and I should tell you that this is well known, and there's been laws in the National Assembly to deal with it. But in the old days, in one of the things that you would see in the dynamism index was you would have, like, say, for example, two laws that were kind of contradictory, right? So you would see rules about construction that required a certain set of procedures, and then land law rules that that appear to be different, and then combine this with environmental rules. And what was happening was businesses didn't know how to operate. Do I need this document or do I need this document? Right? What is it that I'm supposed to do? If I do this, I will be abiding by the land law, but be in violation of the construction law. And usually, what would happen is some official would be willing to take a risk to resolve this problem. And maybe because it had a pecuniary benefit to them, maybe because they really, really cared about the private sector, but they would solve it. And that what's happening now is that rather than solving that problem themselves, they're kicking that back upstairs again and asking for guidance on it, right? And so this is creating these long waiting periods and holding. And the way I've tried to explain this a few times is that, like, I do think, like, yeah, I have no problem with trying to root out corruption, but I do think, like, it needs to accompany institutional change and rules and guidance and clear procedures so that people feel comfortable making decisions. And what has happened is, to some extent, the punishments have gotten out in front of the rules and legal changes. So I think of the anti-corruption campaign as in three pillars. So, like, I think of the blazing furnace and the arrest as one, the changes in party documents and rules about what party officials can do is in two, and then I think about the streamlining of bureaucratic procedures, cadre reforms, and e-governance. Vietnam has this plan to move 80% of administrative procedures and services online by 2035. Like, I think of that as the third one. And I just think that third one is just behind the other two. And so, which is like, and that's causing this sort of stickiness. And that's why I think foreign investors are complaining about this. But for the same reason, you're seeing private firms worry about this as well.
Yeah, I mean, some of that, the digital paperwork type stuff filters down to individual residents as well, which is the topic of, like, another index you're involved with, which I did want to talk about, but I think we might have to save for another episode, actually, because could easily discuss that one for another 45 minutes.
I can tell you what it is, like, for your listeners, and, like, the POPI is measuring governance from the citizen's perspective. And I think that's important, that we shouldn't narrowly think that governance is what is good for businesses. And so that was why POPI was created, and that's what it does. And I think it's had some real impact of its own.
Yeah, and I genuinely want to do another episode about that, because I think it's fascinating, and especially in a country where, because of several reasons, public opinion is not widely disseminated or collected, even, and at least not in, like, a digestible way, especially for English speakers. Another day, though. So, Eddie, thanks so much for taking some time to talk to me. I'll share the links to this year's PCI, and it's really fascinating stuff. I mean, it kind of goes deep on issues that don't, like I said, I think don't get a lot of attention. I mean, I even give short shrift to a lot of this stuff, but it can be a lot, it's a lot to wrap your arms around. So really interesting and important to kind of keep an eye on how things are developing here.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, I think it's a great source of data. There's widgets online if you want to make comparisons or draw out some data of your own. For researchers, there's a lot of cool data that they can use to explore. I agree with you, Mike, that it's some of the topics are not the sexiest topics. My daughter is consistently making fun of me about my focus on regulation, but I think they're very important.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and it has a lot to do with how, the choices Vietnam's had just startling success, but it's in a new stage where it has to build institutions and processes now, and hopefully we can play some small role in helping by providing guidance on what's working and what's not.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so Eddie, thanks again for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this week's episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast. Connect with the Vietnam Weekly on Threads, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Thank you so much for listening, and please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform. See you next week.